WellPod at DC on Riot Radio.
From meditation, stress management, safer substance use, and sexual health, we will literally talk sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Join us to dive deep into some student health questions. We'll learn about wellness together, try some coping tools, and meet some interesting people.
Your co-hosts, Heather and Craig.
Perfect blend of Campus Health and Wellness Center and Sal's.
Each week, we'll DIY a wellness tool together.
And then nerd out and dig into the science behind how it works.
Email your health and wellness related questions to wellpod@durhamcollege.ca to be discussed anonymously on air. Welcome to the WellPod at DC.
Welcome to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. Saturday, November 23rd, 1991, rock band's lead Queen's press officer released a statement on behalf of frontman Freddie Mercury, extraordinary rock star and one of the greatest performers of all times. Following enormous conjecture in the press, I wish to confirm that I have been tested HIV positive and have AIDS. I felt it correct to keep this information private in order to protect the privacy of those around me. However, this time has now come for my friends and my fans around the world to know the truth. I hope everyone will join with me, my doctors and those worldwide, in the fight against this terrible disease. Freddie would die just 24 hours after the statement was released. Human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, is a retrovirus that affects cells of the human immune system. AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is a late stage of HIV infection that occurs when the body's immune system is damaged because of the virus. In 1995, a new class of antiviral drugs became available, and by 1996, almost 10 years after the start of the epidemic, AIDS was no longer the leading cause of death in young adult males in America. 2021 marked the 40th anniversary of the first case of AIDS being formally diagnosed and recognized in the United States. June 5th, in 1981, the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, published an article describing cases of rare lung infection in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. By 1986, 38,000 cases of AIDS were reported in 85 countries globally. Stigmatizing terms such as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, to describe this growing epidemic shifted public perceptions that HIV and AIDS affected only gay men, sparking a lasting stigma that would cost many lives. From the start, HIV and AIDS impacted the world not only in a devastating and heavily stigmatized health crisis, but also sparked massive political movements with a cultural and social transformation. Musical artists like Freddie Mercury played a huge role in raising awareness about HIVs, really accelerating the acceptance of people living with HIV and AIDS. Elton John, Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, even TLC's 1995 hit Waterfalls was all trying to bring awareness and understanding to this cause. They tried to use their platforms to elevate understanding and compassion. Unfortunately, the stigma, lack of education, and hate speech around HIV and AIDS continues to fuel the fire. So this week's student question is, why is HIV still something we need to talk about in 2024? Isn't it treatable now? So today we're going to talk a little bit about understanding HIV and AIDS, and also ending our show talking about rights and advocacy. Today we're joined by some of our community partners, the AIDS Committee of Durham Region. We'd like to welcome Nathan and Lincoln.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so nice to be here.
Yes.
Welcome. So can you tell us a little bit about what ACDR does?
Sure. So we are the AIDS Committee of Durham Region. So we work primarily with people who are living with HIV to provide supports for them. Typically, it surrounds around case management. So we assist with things like medication adherence, attending appointments, being connected to other social services. We also run a food bank every week, and we also have a vitamin bank because vitamins are essential to immune function, so we try to help where we can. We also do education and outreach, which is the department that I manage and that Nathan works on as the youth outreach coordinator. So in that department, we work with Black communities, women, gay men, and youth. These would be people who are at risk, most at risk for HIV acquisition. Often you see us here at Durham College doing outreach. We typically provide condoms, HIV self-test kits, sexual health counseling, therapeutic services, art therapy. We do so much. And then we also have our harm reduction program, which works primarily with people who use substances and are homeless, to provide them with unused supplies to reduce the risk of hepatitis C and HIV transmission.
So to answer that student question a little bit, kind of more heads-on, why is this something that we're still maybe talking about? Maybe helping to explain a little bit about what is HIV and AIDS. So for individuals that maybe haven't really heard these terms or just heard it in a Cyndi Lauper song before, what's a really kind of basic way to explain what's HIV and AIDS?
Sure, I can take that one.
Sure.
Yeah. So HIV, to put it in simple terms, is a virus that attacks your immune system. To go a little bit more scientific, in particular, it attacks these cells called CD4 cells. It's a type of T helper cell, which is a white blood cell. So what HIV's goal to do is to infect all of those CD4 cells and to replicate to the point that you don't have any immune function left. That is when we start getting into an AIDS diagnosis. So HIV and AIDS are the same thing. It's just that AIDS is a syndrome that is caused by the HIV virus. So somebody develops an AIDS diagnosis when their CD4 cell count drops below 200 parts per milliliter of blood, or they get one or more opportunistic infections, which these are infections that somebody with normal immune function would fight off. So things like toxoplasmosis, tuberculosis, herpes, certain cancers, Kaposi sarcoma, which is, if you see any documentaries from the 80s and you see some of the people who are passing from AIDS and they have those splotches all over their body, that's Kaposi sarcoma. So those are infections that someone with normal immune function would typically fight off. So if you get one of those infections and you have an HIV diagnosis, then your HIV diagnosis moves to AIDS. One thing that I do want to point out is that once you do achieve an AIDS diagnosis, you can still get your immune function back and actually go back down to an HIV diagnosis. The issue is that, if you end up developing chronic tuberculosis, you will have that forever. If you end up developing hepatitis B, you will have that forever. But if you, got a case of toxoplasmosis and you got over it and you achieved your immune function back, then you're just back to an HIV diagnosis.
You mentioned some specific populations that you try to really target and really support. That kind of term, more at-risk populations, came up. So who would you say is kind of the most at risk, and why maybe is this group the most at risk?
Okay. So I do want to say that any person who engages in any behavior that is at risk for HIV is at risk for transmission. So if you are having unprotected sex with multiple partners, it's non-monogamous, or if you're using intravenous drug use, you're at risk, or if you're using intravenous drugs, you're at risk for HIV. However, there are certain populations that are more represented in the epidemic. They're disproportionately represented. So that would be Black communities, Indigenous communities, gay men, women, including trans women, youth, sex workers, people who use injectable drugs, and incarcerated people.
And I would imagine that why is really complex to try to quickly explain why these specific populations are more at risk.
It's this sort of idea of social determinants of health. These sort of non-medical factors that impact our health, how we engage in accessing healthcare. So for instance, this could be things like If you don't have equitable job opportunities, are you able to afford housing? If you don't have housing, maybe your healthcare is not going to be your priority. You want a roof over your head first. If you can't afford transportation, are you able to get to and from your medical appointments? Do you have coverage for medications that isn't covered by provincial coverage? And so it's all of these sort of factors that aren't directly things like whether you're sick or you're not sick that can make it more or less difficult for folks to get the care that they need. And in these cases, it's often marginalized folks who are experiencing this at a disproportionate rate.
I would imagine then when we kind of think about how do we reduce the risks around HIV, it makes it complicated as well, trying to speak to some of these populations when those social determinants of health are maybe not being met. But what are some ways all of us can reduce the risks of developing HIV?
Yeah, so I mean, I think kind of the first thing that comes up when people think of reducing any STBBI risk is going to be condoms. Great tool when folks use them correctly, and that's a really important word, correctly. They're 90 to 95% effective. And the great thing is there's so many different versions of them that can meet different needs. There's different types of materials. If you're allergic to latex, there's polyisoprene and polyurethane. If you don't want to put a condom on a penis, there's internal condoms to go into a vagina or in an anus. If you're performing oral sex and you want to reduce STBBI risk, there's dental dams. There's so many different options that make it so folks can kind of decide which of those barriers work and which don't. Something that I find kind of funny is the idea of like, well, condom size, anyone can wear a regular condom. I do want to put it out there, like size does matter with condoms. And that's why we say like correct use. Are we checking to make sure the condom's not expired or punctured? Are we wearing the right size? Because if it's too big, it might slip off. If it's too small, it might break and it'll be uncomfortable.
I was wondering about sizing because I saw one brand in particular, which I won't mention since we don't get any endorsements. They sell like a kit almost, like a package where they come with lots of different sizes so that you can kind of see what's fit. And I was like, are they just trying to make some more money here? But it's actually something that can help ensure that the condom's being used properly as fit matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've all probably at some time either personally seen or heard about those stories of teachers taking a condom, stretching them all the way over their arm, and like, look, it can go all the way up here so it can fit on any size penis. And like, yes, but it's also important to remember that like that size under no friction is going to perform very differently than size under friction and pressure, right? And so if it's already stretched because it's not a good size, that friction's going to increase the chance of breakage, and that's where we're going to see increased risk.
And I imagine too, if something is uncomfortable, it would reduce my likelihood of using it if it's not feeling comfortable.
Correct.
Exactly.
So better fit, more comfort, much more likely to make sure I'm engaging in condom use.
Absolutely. Beyond condoms, obviously, Lincoln mentioned we have a harm reduction department. Being able to provide folks with sterile substance use equipment so that they can still choose how to engage or not engage in activities, have the option to do so in a way that will reduce chances of spreading Hep C, HIV, and other sort of bloodborne illnesses. We really have this philosophy in how we reduce risk about choice. And so harm reduction is really, really great in that way because it recognizes that some folks may want to reduce risk, may not want to. Making sure that they have free access to those equipments, though. Just because, especially with Hep C, sharing substance use equipment can really increase your risk of bloodborne illness.
I just want to add one thing. There was a study done in Toronto, and they found that cities that implemented needle exchange programs would see an annual average a decrease in HIV by 18.1% compared to an average annual increase of HIV of 8.6% in cities that do not have needle exchange programs. So the needle exchange program is very beneficial in reducing the transmission of HIV because intravenous drug use is the third most risky behavior for HIV transmission.
You do love a stat.
I do.
Yeah, you're the silent science girly of the team. Yeah. So, and then beyond that, some big stuff that we have are also access to different medications, which I think we're going to get into a little bit.
Yeah,
now.
tell us more about medications. Because I think
Yes.
this is a misconception that I often hear, is that if we were to get that diagnosis of HIV, that this is going to be something that maybe isn't going to be able to be managed, and I will always be able to pass it off. But I'm seeing, for instance, the O equals O, or is it 0 equals 0?
U equals U.
U equals
Yes,
U,
yes,
yes. And
yes.
medications, really trying to talk about PrEP, for instance. So tell us more about medications and PrEP.
Yeah, so there are 3 main medications that are involved in preventing HIV transmission. So you have PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, which just means that you take it before exposure to HIV. And then there's also PEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis. You take that after. So PrEP and this thing called PrEP on demand, which is a little bit newer. PrEP is taken daily at the same time to prevent HIV transmission. And PrEP on demand is fairly similar. It's the same drugs, but you take 2 pills 24 hours prior to a sexual encounter, followed by 1 pill daily until 48 hours after that encounter. So that is really useful for events like Pride, where you might not be an overly sexual person throughout the most of the year, so you don't really need to take PrEP every day, but you might want to go have some sex at Pride, so you'll be able to at least protect yourself from HIV. So with PEP, that's taken afterwards. So you need to access it in Ontario at an emergency room only. You can at the hospital, so not urgent care.
I
not
imagine that's a bit of a barrier.
It's a huge barrier.
But still available.
Still available.
there.
Still available.
Go
And
to your ER.
things are changing with that. So it does consist of taking HIV medications for 28 days. And so ideally, if you have had to access PEP, they will say you should probably be taking PrEP. So you take HIV medications, either Biktarvy or a combination of Truvada and Tivicay. There's this other thing, though, called PIP, which is PEP in my pocket. So it's something that we're trying to push to legislation to change so that people can actually have a stash of PEP at home so that they can just access it when they need it. This is very important for sex workers, people who engage in sex work, who might frequently be exposed to HIV. PIP is a really, really good tool for that. Beyond PrEP and PEP, we also have antiretroviral therapy, which is medications that are taken by somebody who is HIV positive. So you have PrEP, which is taken before, PEP, which is taken after but before infection, and then ART, which is taken after infection. And there are 6 primary antiretroviral drugs that target each stage of the HIV replication cycle to suppress that viral replication. So that's really how these drugs work, and to also maintain that undetectable viral load. And the reason that is important is for 2 reasons. The first is that antiretroviral therapy allows people living with HIV to live long, healthy lives and avoid an AIDS diagnosis. The second is that when you achieve a viral load, achieve a suppressed viral load or an undetectable viral load, there's actually a 0% chance of you passing the virus on sexually.
Wow.
So it's it's one of the only medications that has gotten a 100% effective stamp of approval. PrEP is 99.99% effective.
So I would imagine when this first was coming out, how significant an impact that had in the community.
It was huge.
Huge.
It was, life-changing for people that are living with HIV.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We talked about diabetes last week.
Yeah, so there it
we
goes.
go.
It's giving me the
a good
warning.
refresh.
Giving us an alarm.
There we go.
So what I would imagine would be really exciting about this in a way is that not only you're living a longer, healthier life, but we're sexual beings as human beings. We've talked about sex on the show before. And so the idea then that you still want to engage in conversations about status, but I would imagine that reduced a lot of stigma and a lot of barrier in the community.
And I don't want to speak for all people living with HIV, but most most that I have spoken to will tell you that the hardest thing about living with HIV is disclosure, is having to worry about potentially transmitting the virus to their partner. That is the biggest thing. It's not having to take the medications. It's not the fact that they might die from it. It's the fact that it creates such social isolation. So this undetectable equals untransmissible, which is what the what we call it, was really, really big in lifting that burden from people who are living with HIV.
Wow.
And it also kind of started to inform everyone else that like HIV isn't this doom and gloom death sentence that we kind of continued the idea of based out of what was happening in the 80s and even early 90s. It made it so people started to understand that like it is a different way of having to navigate life. It is not this, okay, you know, count your minutes. Because in fact, now we're seeing people who are living with HIV and have an undetectable viral load are actually living on average longer than people who are HIV negative. And that's because they're able to access the medications to keep them in a good immune state. And they're consistently seeing their doctor. I know as someone who has no reason to need to consistently see my doctor, I avoid that like the
Absolutely.
I know. I'm seeing him for the first time in 2 years tomorrow.
Yes.
So.
Right, literally, right? I go in when I need some antidepressants, and then I avoid for another 6 months. And because the doctors are intimidating, they're scary, right? And so a lot of us kind of avoid that. However, that becomes a part of that self-care piece. And because folks who are living with HIV and have been able to achieve that undetectable viral load, they're seeing their doctors, they're catching things before they become problems.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about how people can access testing and the importance of testing? What are your thoughts on testing for HIV and AIDS?
I think the important thing is that testing is the only way to know your status. It's not the sort of virus that is going to take hold in your body and you're going to notice. In many cases, folks can go months, years, almost up to 10 years before they will start to see noticeable symptoms of something. And even then, it's of something, right? You don't necessarily know what that something is. Because in a lot of ways, HIV will present as flu-like symptoms, cold-like symptoms. So you may not necessarily think that there is a larger issue going on with your immune system.
Once there's a serious symptom, like something very, very serious, that indicates that you have an AIDS diagnosis. So it's very important to just test.
It allows you to, again, like kind of check on your health before things might become bigger concerns than they could become. And so, like being able to test is really important, in not only your own health, it's also really important in being able to kind of create space where it's normal to talk about these things and talk about diagnoses, again, challenging that stigma. And so if you are someone who might be at risk, it's a great way to kind of keep check on your own health and see where you're at, and also normalize that process for other people that you know, normalize that process for your partners as well.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
One thing that as well is the biggest vector for transmission is when people don't know their status. That is when the transmission happens. People who know their status and are going to the doctor and are achieving viral suppression and they're on medication, they're not transmitting the virus. It's people who don't know their status. And those first few months of infection where like HIV can take over your entire immune system in, I believe, maybe 48 hours. It can replicate that quickly. So it's really important to test because those first few months that you have actually got the infection is when you are most contagious. So that's why testing is also super important. Also to connect people to care immediately upon that so that you can get on your HIV medications and you can achieve viral suppression as soon as possible.
No apologies. You take care of you.
Right?
You take care of you.
Okay.
Yes.
For testing, what are some avenues that students, but our whole campus and community can get connected for testing?
I am so glad you asked. So obviously, like in terms of clinics and things like that, there are some sexual health clinics in both Oshawa and Pickering. You can go to your family doctor, walk-in clinics, get the sort of requisition forms. ACDR has also been a part of the HIV self-test kit project. And I also know that there is an I'm Ready launch coming up, I believe, next Wednesday.
Absolutely, yeah. The Campus Health and Wellness Center, we partner with the current kind of connected to a research study on self-testing kits. And so you do have to download an app. But I think the whole premise of downloading the app when you get a free kit is so that you're connected to that care.
Exactly.
So if you do test positive, right away you have individuals that you can connect with. So that way you don't go to that doom and gloom, that kind of misunderstanding worst place, and you're connected with a peer who's able to say, hey, you got this, and we have some resources here to help you with this positive detection. Yeah.
Can I ask even some of the resources you were saying before about like people using drugs and or needles, I should say, that are then potentially passing on? But you were saying safe. I forget the term, like injection sites or whatnot. Is that like, how does that tie into ACDR, or is it connections to other partners?
It does not tie
Bit
into
of a hot
ACDR.
topic.
It's a very hot topic.
Okay, sorry.
That's
No,
okay.
Was I supposed to avoid it?
There are no safe consumption sites in the Durham region. There will not be any for a while. They have primarily been in Peterborough, Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. I can't remember the number, but I do know that at least 3 were shut down in Toronto with the recent legislation. But it is something that we still try to push for, because not only do safe consumption sites reduce HIV transmissions, they also reduce overdoses significantly. So, yeah.
And while we continue that fight, right now people do have access to safer injection kits
They do.
Yes.
through the
Okay.
ACDR,
They do,
alongside
yes.
with the condoms and other tools to
Absolutely.
support that.
Yeah. We have honestly a really wide variety of different sort of sterile substance use equipment. We also do stuff like provide naloxone training for folks who want to learn how to intervene in a potential overdose situation.
And
so
fentanyl
there's-
testing kits. when we
And
have them.
fentanyl testing
Yeah.
kits, yes.
And I would imagine those are really great, especially if you're going to places like a music festival or a pride event,
Exactly.
where you maybe aren't aware of the
Yes.
substance, not your regular area where you're normally getting it from.
That's definitely what it's going to be used most for, because like we do have some clients that use opiates and fentanyl, so obviously they're not using fentanyl testing kits. But for our clients that might be using methamphetamines or taking party drugs like ecstasy, or using crack, it's a good tool so that they know if they go to use it that they're not going to drop from an accidental fentanyl overdose.
Yeah.
Because that's where we see the most deaths, is that somebody thought that they were going to smoke some meth and then there was actually fentanyl and they...
Which you can't tell because it's odorless, tasteless.
Yeah.
It's hard to visibly even see. And so, it's folks thinking that they're, being given one thing and there's in fact something else in there that's
So it
that their
empowers you to
body
know.
wasn't ready for.
Exactly.
So currently, while there is no cure for HIV and AIDS, we are working really hard at getting to that point. Researchers have been following a few cases in Europe where individuals living with HIV have received bone marrow transplants to cure their cancer, and the donor stem cells have genetic mutated and block the HIV virus from entering the cells. And so both patients were cured of their cancers, but also HIV was wiped from their bodies. So this has been a truly pivotal point of research. We're trying to move towards things like a vaccine to help reduce some of the barriers to some of the current
Moderna's
meds.
working on that.
Yeah, it's very exciting. So this is giving us a lot of hope in our communities that a cure may actually be possible, and there's scientific basis for believing that a cure is almost here. So pre-exposure medications is highlighted to reduce our risks of transmissions, current treatments enabling those that are living positive to live meaningful, long lives. Hope is still here, but we still have a lot of work to do. So coming up after this break, we're going to explore some rights and some advocacy back here on riotradio.ca. Nudge if I'm looking at the wrong table, wrong camera. Welcome back to the WellPod, live from the Media Hub on riotradio.ca. So 1988 was the year in which the World AIDS Day was first observed from the World Health Organization. More than 61,000 AIDS-related deaths would be reported across the U.S. that year alone. The height of the epidemic was marked by terror and tragedy and rage, but also the immense resilience of the LGBTQ community and many others that were doing groundbreaking work and of activism and research around the world. So, Nathan and Lincoln, what does the World's AIDS Day theme, Take the Right Path, mean?
Yeah, so the idea of taking the rights path is looking at the idea that all of our health, and especially HIV work, is directly related to our human rights. So right now, we're kind of looking at progressing towards that 95-95-95 goal. So essentially 95% of people knowing their HIV status, 95% of people living with HIV being connected to medication, and 95% of those people then having an undetectable viral load. And we're realizing that if we're really going to try to hit that goal, we need to focus on human rights. Our sexual health is so related to our rights. For instance, for folks who have experienced gender-based violence, are they able to safely access medical care, especially navigating stigma, potential re-victimization? Are we safe places for folks to have equitable access to education that represents more than one type of sexual health? And then a big one is also, are we a safe place for, quote unquote, same-sex relations to happen? In fact, there are studies that have shown that in countries where same-sex relations are criminalized, they're actually 5 times more at risk for acquiring HIV. And that's because, again, you have to be secretive. You can't openly access or ask questions or seek support because you risk facing criminalization. And on top of that, we're obviously a big sort of hot button topic going on right now is the changes to sexual health rights, bodily autonomy rights. And so we're kind of seeing the sort of HIV work start to recognize that we need to have a more considerable focus on making sure that folks have rights, making sure that folks are able to access what they need to access, and that the rights of the country back them up on that, and make sure that they can access this support equitably.
And I would imagine back in the 80s when this epidemic started, that was a big barrier, was the lack of rights that many individuals had during that time. You mentioned, for instance, some of the different at-risk populations and communities, Black communities, for instance, and queer communities. So I'd imagine that even though we are making some progress in a lot of ways, we still have quite a lot of work to do in making sure that we're recognizing this link to human rights is our health rights.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit of the current state of HIV criminalization in Canada?
Let's go away.
Yes, I can. So I do want to preface before we start, this is not legal advice. This is
we gotta
legal
cover ourselves here.
information. I am not a lawyer. I did not pass the bar. If you do need legal advice surrounding HIV disclosure, then you can go to the HIV/AIDS Legal Clinic of Ontario at helco.org. That is where we get all this information from. So in Canada, criminal non-disclosure, the law around that is rather ambiguous. Many courts have said many different things. So the Supreme Court has decided that you only need to disclose your status if there is a realistic possibility of transmission. The issue is that the courts have not really defined what that realistic possibility of transmission is. So in general, there is no duty to disclose your status when you're engaging in an activity that there is no risk for transmission, so like kissing, stuff like that. Or if you use a condom and you have achieved a suppressed viral load, so less than 200 copies of the virus per milliliter of blood. Some courts in Canada, some provincial courts, have determined that you do not need to disclose your status if you've achieved viral suppression, regardless of whether or not you wore a condom, but that needs to be for a minimum of 6 months. In Ontario, the law is you need to have a suppressed viral load and you need to use a condom. So the consequences of HIV criminalization in Canada is that people are a lot less likely to access support services and healthcare out of fear of criminalization. If I tell my doctor that I'm HIV positive and I'm having sex with people, are they going to report me? What public health actually can do in Ontario is, I can't remember what the form is called, but there's this specific form that they can use where a nurse just determines that you are a very high risk of transmitting, and they can follow you like Big Brother. Every person you have sex with, you need to report back to them every week, and all this kind of stuff. If you don't, then you can be charged. So that is another big thing. If you're convicted and you are not a Canadian citizen, you can be deported. If you are a Canadian citizen, you can be imprisoned. You'll have a criminal record for a minimum of 5 to 10 years, and you will be put on a sex offender registry for the rest of your life, even if transmission did not occur.
Yeah, this is because they treat it as an aggravated sexual assault charge. Canada's the only country in the world that does that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Canada actually currently has one of the highest rates of HIV criminal cases globally, and it's because we have incredibly outdated laws, and we prosecute people for criminal non-disclosure even when the HIV transmission didn't occur. So I know I have a few clients who this has happened to, and there was no HIV transmission, and they were still charged and tried in court. Sometimes the charges are dropped, but the issue is, for instance, the news might pick that story up that you've been charged, and they post your face on the news, and that's going to be there forever because we know the news does not take those things down. So that has happened to a few people in Ontario living with HIV. So the advice that I would, not the advice, but the best practices.
See, that alarm just told you.
Use the word best practice.
The best practice.
Setting it up well today.
Is if you are someone who is living with HIV, you either disclose your status to your partner to ensure that to ensure that you're just covering your bases, or you ensure that you have achieved viral suppression and you wear condoms every time if you are not comfortable disclosing your status to sexual partners. But I always encourage folks that I'm kind of counseling through disclosure that it's just best that you deal with it head on and disclose your status. Just to protect yourself fully from any repercussions. Because even if you used a condom and you have achieved viral suppression, the cops still might charge you. So that's why I always say just disclose your status for your safety.
And as a whole community, really making sure that each and every one of us recognizes the role we have in normalizing knowing our status and engaging these conversations. So regardless of hopefully some changing legal connotation, that it's just kind of this consensual and excitable part of the conversation of, hey, what's your status? When was the last time you tested? And kind of adding to that idea of human rights and health rights. This is then just part of our regular health routine. But we have a lot of work to do to make sure that access to testing, access for these conversations is as streamlined and cleared up as possible.
And I just want to bounce back to you equals you. If somebody is living with HIV and they've achieved viral suppression and they're on medications, they cannot pass the virus on to you. It's impossible. It has never happened since we have found that discovery. So that's, I think, the one thing that I'd like to leave everyone with.
Absolutely. A couple of resources if people were to kind of explore outside of ACDR, but other resources that you'd recommend people kind of explore and to learn a little bit more, learn about testing. Are there some that come to mind?
My favorite one is this site called SexFluent. It is created by and for at-risk youth. And so something I find a lot in the sort of resource development is sometimes we forget to include the communities we're trying to resource to in the process. And so they don't necessarily actually meet the needs of those communities. And this was so foundationally involving youth. And it's really, really fun. They have like the drag queen patron saint of mental health and like sexual health and testing and all of this. Super cute, super fun. And it has so much good information. So that's my go-to.
Yeah.
One that I actually like, which I think is actually can be beneficial for some students, is this website called Toronto Party Vibe. And it's pretty much gives you all the information you need to know in order to use, if you are going to be using party drugs, to use those safely, what not to mix with, what medications might have negative effects with other substances. So that is another really, really good resource. I've never seen anything like it.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah, it's I believe it is in partnership with the AIDS Committee of Toronto.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
And then if none of those fancy you and you just saw us today and you thought, we need to talk to these two gorgeous, stunning, humble, smart, fabulous people.
Exactly my
obviously,
thoughts that I was thinking.
Of course. Obviously,
Very humble.
AIDS Committee of Durham Region, we have so many resources. In fact, something I am absolutely going to toot my horn here, something that I've been able to do with Durham College as well as Ontario Tech and even Trent Durham is I do series of workshops every semester that talk about some of these different things. And so actually usually we start off with a safer partying workshop. How can we still go have fun while making sure we at least know how we could reduce some risk if we want to. How can we have some really good consent conversations and feel comfortable with our partners? And also stuff like how can we have disclosure conversations and coming out conversations? Because there's a lot of similar stresses between those. And so we also obviously...
What's the series called?
It's the Let's Talk Sex series.
Thank you.
There we go.
Channeling some Sue Johansson there.
Yes.
Yes.
If you'd like to come and talk to ACDR, we're always available.
Absolutely. Websites, links, how can we find you?
So you can get in contact with us at www.aidsdurham.com/contact. Especially if you're looking for student placements. We tend to bring on folks from the Addictions and Mental Health program and the Social Service Worker program. So if you are interested in student placement, that's where you'd go, aidsdurham.com/contact. You can follow us, you can follow Nathan on social media at ACDR Youth on Instagram.
And for those of you who are a little outdated like me, Facebook too.
You're still on Facebook.
I'm still on Facebook.
Okay.
What's that? I'm old enough to know.
And if there'd be kind of just one final, you already, Nathan, very nicely kind of said one kind of final thing you wanted to leave the crew with. But if there's kind of one kind of overarching theme or key message, what would be kind of a final note you'd like to leave students with hearing?
Recognize that we all have these concerns and worries. Talking about sex is going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. Let's be uncomfortable together and make it okay to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. I was reading the Journal of Healthcare for Underserved. They had an article called Popular Culture and Shaping HIV Perception that came out in August of this summer. And they said, we believe that anyone can be an HIV advocate by amplifying. And then they had 4 things they really thought was helpful to amplify. There's medication, PrEP, that can prevent people from getting HIV with 1 pill a day. 2, routine treatment stops the virus from being passed on by people living with HIV. People receiving HIV care can survive and thrive. And I love that they were really trying to emphasize that idea of thrive. We've heard about, especially a lot of the negative horrors that were happening at the start of this epidemic in the 80s, but we need to see many more messages of that thriving and that living with HIV. And then having open, as you kind of highlighted there, having open and empathetic conversations to help eliminate the stigma that can surround our status sometimes. So I love their message here is that anyone can be a powerful and influential voice. And so thank you for the work that AIDS Committee of Durham Region is doing.
Thank you.
And we'll share all of our resources and all the different tools that were mentioned on our Wellness at DC account. But alas, this is the end of our show today. We'll have you back possibly in the spring. We'll kind of see if you'll come join us again. And don't forget, you can email your questions to be anonymously discussed on air at wellpod@durhamcollege.ca. Next week, we have a case of the grumpies, and we're going to talk about navigating negative emotions. Don't forget forget, you can also follow the DCSA Media Hub on social media at DCSA Media Hub. Thanks for exploring what it means to be well and joining us with our community partners, the AIDS Committee of Durham Region, today, live from the Media Hub on riotradio.ca.